Well, good morning, everyone.
Welcome and thank you for joining us today. We're excited to have the second in our new series of webinars. We're bringing to you in collaboration between Digny and LEDA HR. So we're really excited today to have a very special guest, Fiona McFarlane, to be able to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and employment law. To start, of course, as we always start, we want to take a moment to really express our deep, heartfelt gratitude and respect to Indigenous people across this land. In particular, as we're joining you here today from the land of the Coast Salish peoples, which is largely comprised of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Thank you so much to Indigenous elders and all Indigenous people across this land. So our special guest today is Fiona McFarlane, and we've already had some opportunity to chat with Fiona and had some really interesting discussion. So I know that this is going to be a great conversation today. Fiona has over 10 years of legal experience on issues as diverse as human rights, Indigenous rights and title, estates, contract law, and workplace investigation. So a lot of really interesting areas. And certainly areas that are very, very important to discussions around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Fiona's mission is to help find solutions to the challenges faced by girls and women. Fiona is a longtime volunteer with the Girl Guides of Canada, volunteering weekly, and the role of BC Risk and Compliance Coordinator from 2017 to 2020. Thank you so much for joining us, Fiona. We're really excited to have you today. And facilitating the discussion today is our very own Elizabeth Cook of Digny, co-founder. Elizabeth is a trusted advisor to government, organizations and associations, and industry. As a lawyer by training, she specializes in diversity management. She is the founder of Inclusivity and Digny. She provides commentary and analysis for major media organizations, including CTV, global, and post-media outlets, on the issues of diversity and inclusion. And me, I'm a partner in LEDA HR. My name is KRISTIN Bauer, and I've worked in human resources for over 20 years, 10 years of which have been dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I've led work in the areas of strategy design, intercultural competency, mental health advocacy, and psychologically safe and healthy workplaces. And I'm delighted to have provided this introduction today. And now I'm going to pass it over to Liz and Fiona.
Thanks so much, KRISTIN. First, we want to give a disclaimer, because anytime you're dealing with lawyers, they have to have disclaimers and they have to say it depends. It's mandatory. So the first disclaimer that we need to share is that this isn't legal advice. We are purely sharing some personal opinions and experience. It's not legal advice, and our conversation is really situated around BC law. Fiona, do you want to add to the disclaimer as well to ease your conscience?
Yeah, so I'm not here representing my employer. My current employer is WorkSafe BC, Occupational Health and Safety. I'm here because of my connections to this world from my previous experiences and my love of the work of what Digny and LEDA are doing. I have done, as you heard, employment law in its purest form, like the human rights law. So the information sharing here, as said, is not legal advice. I will say, if you are from a province other than BC, there are many similarities between all the provinces in Canada when it comes to human rights issues. If you're joining us from the US, I think we don't have anyone from the US right now. Then there's a very different scheme down there that I'm not aware of. But what I'll be sharing is pretty similar in most of the provinces, as well as the federally regulated industries.
Perfect, thank you. So we thought about the different kind of questions that we wanted to discuss in this webinar, and there's three main areas. And the first one that we wanted to talk about was around quotas and promotions. So Fiona, this is a question that I get a lot, and Anna and KRISTIN get it a lot as well, is talking about what are the legal repercussions for promotion and hiring practices that seek out diversity? So I think what people are really asking is, am I at risk of this idea of reverse discrimination if I'm trying to hire different groups of people? So often we're talking about either the employment equity groups, if we're looking at, at federally regulated areas, so looking at women, people of color, indigenous folk, like visible minorities, and indigenous folks, and people with disabilities. So if you're seeking out them as candidates or seeking them out for promotion, and then also in sectors other than the federal government, if you're looking at them for promotions onto boards or advancing their careers or quotas, can you get sued for reverse discrimination? What does that actually what does that process actually look like, and what are the legal boundaries that we see there?
So a good starting point is to understand that discriminating in employment is a problem, and somebody could make a complaint. You could have an employee or somebody even during the hiring process. For instance, if you had an advertisement that had discriminatory language in it, you could, as an employer, be subject of a human rights complaint. And what does that look like? Well, if somebody says, I've got one of the protected characteristics, such as my gender, I always have to check this because it's quite a long list. It's race and color. I'm not going to get into all the nuances of what those mean, but it is something you can look to the Human Rights Tribunal and get some sense from some decisions. And this is where to understand too, it is helpful to get some legal advice, because it is sometimes it depends scenario, as Elizabeth joked earlier.
I knew it. It was that like 8 minutes, and we already got an it depends.
So place of origin as well. So if you do have somebody who's come from somewhere other than Canada, place of origin, that's where that falls. Religion as well. We've heard a bit more of that probably recently, since the COVID pandemic's come in and we've had different policies come in the workplace. Sexual orientation, both physical and mental disabilities fall under those protected characteristics. And political belief is a little bit different from religion, but you can kind of qualify them as a bit similar. And then family status and marital status are, again, similar to each other, but have some nuances. And age. So if you had, for instance, an advertisement for jobs saying you only wanted young and dynamic people to apply, that probably would run afoul of the BC Human Rights Code, and somebody could make a complaint about that. That being said, there have found that certain schemes related to retirement are actually acceptable, but we won't get into that right now. So what does a Human Rights Tribunal complaint look like? It looks like somebody filing a complaint saying, hey, I have a personal characteristic and something happened that was negative in my employment because of that personal characteristic. And then the employer gets to say, oh, okay, well, actually, that wasn't because of the personal characteristic. That was because of something else. So there is a potential for justifying a discriminatory act. What would that look like? That would, in this context of kind of seeking out diversity and equity in an employment context, if your board, if your senior leadership kind of make a decision based on available data that they really do want to see a certain group of people, they want to benefit immigrants coming from somewhere else because there's somebody who's kind of looked and gone, wait a minute, we don't have any immigrants. We want to represent Canadian society better, and Canadian society includes immigrants. Then if there's a set out policy and there's kind of reasons, and you're looking at similarly qualified people, but one might be from that group, you've decided to look to have better equality, better equity and diversity in your workplace, then that would be something that you could justify.
Yeah, because I see that a lot with a lot of clients that we work with, and a lot of folks that I just talk to generally, or some friends that like to challenge me based on the type of job that I have, and they like to do it for fun. But coming up with that idea of like, well, I made the example a little while ago. There was a funding program, to create employment, and groups that were minority groups were strongly encouraged to apply. So this was in the tech sector. So they were trying to increase women, because we're trying to increase women in STEM programs, also trying to increase the representation of Indigenous folks. and people of color. And they said, well, can you put that in a job description? So because I'm like a white guy, I'm not going to get hired for that. Like, that's discrimination. But what, I've talked with them about is, that when we're talking about our current practices for hiring, if you're with an organization and your company wants to increase the representation in the community, wants to support diversity, equity, so reducing barriers that other people face, not the idea of equality, but equity, and creating an inclusive environment where everybody feels like they belong there, there's ways to do that. And, part of that is the other thing that lawyers say all the time is you have to document everything. Some lawyers might tell you not to document some things, but that's another kettle of fish that we'll deal with later. But if you are documenting everything and you have this goal of wanting to be more diverse, you have to have that as your strategy. And when you first identify that at that senior level, and it trickles down in your strategy, and you have your inclusive hiring that makes a part of your strategy, and promotions are a part of that as well in identifying what you want to support. I understand that to mean, from what you said, Fiona, is that you can do that as part of your strategy. You can promote creating and fostering a diverse workplace that is inclusive without running afoul, of a human rights complaint where they can find that there was discrimination, but it was justified in this instance because you're discriminating in a sense to promote inclusion or to promote the diversity of a certain group of folks.
And I am one of those lawyers that I do generally suggest documentation. And part of that is because if you did have a complaint to the BC Human Rights Tribunal, you're going to want to have that paper trail. Mm-hmm. And you're showing in front of the Human Rights Tribunal your justification. And basically it's showing you did it in good faith. Mm-hmm. You did some research. You had a consultant say, really, you're not representing Canadian society right now. You're missing these kind of groups. And you may want to consider strategies. You've done it in good faith because you want to be more representative of Canadian society. Mm-hmm. And you've taken all reasonable efforts to avoid discrimination that's mm-hmm. being complained about. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
so that's where the documentation comes in. And yeah. I often say it can be something like a vision statement. It doesn't necessarily need to be a huge paper trail. But when you want people looking at two different people, like, make sure you're kind of like looking at why you are, mm-hmm. Don't like it say this person and this person. It's
And there's two important things in there. You can have one of the protected characteristics, right? So under BC human rights law, everything around race and ethnicity, family status, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, religious belief, like all of those pieces, you can have a protected characteristic and have that not be the reason why you either got a job or didn't get a job. Just the mere fact of having a protected characteristic does not mean that the Human Rights Tribunal is going to find like in your favor or against you. It's read in context of everything else that's occurring. So the documentation part is really important for the Human Rights Tribunal, but internally, everybody needs to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. You need to be transparent. Because if you don't tell the rest of your staff that you're looking to be more diverse, you want to support that, and make sure that everybody can see themselves in that picture. Because sometimes what we do is we talk about diversity and inclusion, and we make it seem, like people that are in a majority class that are identified, are white folks, or are the white man that people seem to think we're trying to exclude from things, which is not the case. They need to realize that they're a part of the positivity that's coming. They're a part of having an inclusive workspace that works really well together. And if you're not transparent about what you're doing and making sure everybody realizes that they have a part to play in the positive workspace and culture that you're creating, you're going to have more problems. So you need to document everything and be really clear, just generally across the board, in understanding what you're doing, why it's your strategy, why it actually makes sense to do this, over a calendar year, both for the Human Rights Tribunal, if there's ever an issue, which hopefully there isn't, but also to communicate that to your staff so that everybody understands what you're doing and why you're doing it, because that will help the onboarding process go. Because, when we talk about hiring, we talk about attraction and we talk about retention, because it's one thing to get those folks in the door and hire them, But to have people want to stay in the job and, you know, enjoy working there and be able to contribute positively in the workplace is a whole other kettle of fish.
I definitely personally have transparency as one of my kind of core values, and I do think it is important in a workplace, just like what you said, to have it known that there's a goal here for the whole organization. It goes to the workplace culture, the employee engagement, and like thinking as a lawyer going in front of the Human Rights Tribunal, if I can say that this employer made it known, and this person who is alleging discrimination, potentially reverse discrimination, I can at least say, look, like it was transparent, the why and the reasons for this. This person did know it. Yes, they have a personal characteristic, but in the grand scheme of things, the personal impact is minimal, or you can justify that discrimination. So it is possible. It sounds horrible on its face to say you can justify discrimination, but in that employment context, if there has been somebody who's, for reasons of a personal characteristic, had a negative effect, it could be that there's something that's bigger than them in the workplace that can kind of justify it. So it's that context.
And we certainly we have times in employment law where you know that kind of discrimination is allowed, right? When we look at like our duty to accommodate or the, you know, bona fide occupational requirements, we see that getting divided up a little bit. And sometimes those are easier lines to draw than when we're you know, looking at human rights rather than a duty to accommodate. But I'm going to move on to our next question, because we hear about this a fair bit, and I don't even actually teach it that much, but the duty to inquire. Can you talk to us about what the duty to inquire is, and maybe briefly, well, I'm interested in where it comes from. Everybody else might not be, but a little bit about that.
It generally is seen in cases where you've had a worker who's been off work because of an injury, and they're returning to work. So you as the employer, you have a duty to accommodate, but you can't accommodate what you haven't inquired about, really. Like that's a bit how it comes in. So you've had an injured worker, they're returning to work. You as an employer have a responsibility to find out what they need. Do you need, because it was a broken leg, and now you've got a permanent limp, do you need a workplace where there's no stairs, for instance? And I'm really just doing this off the top of my head, so please forgive me my scenarios. They may not be all that nuanced. It does come up as well in mental health disability kind of claims and issues. It's sometimes a very hard one. And I would say, from my perspective, again, this is my opinion, that the pandemic has created some real challenges when it comes to how does an employer inquire about mental health? How does an employer inquire about the impacts of the pandemic on family status? So family status in BC, if the employer has changed something in the workplace that means that you as a caregiver can no longer provide the care that you did to, usually it's a child, it could be other family members depending on your individual facts. How do you make those inquiries now? How do you, without being too nosy? Like, it's definitely a bit of a funny scenario. It's very easy when it comes to like somebody's been off work. They've had an injury, whether it's mental health or physical injury, or they've asked for a time period off to deal with something, and you want them to come back to work. You still have their job available to you, and you're accommodating them. You just don't know how to yet, so you're starting to inquire. It is a two-way conversation always between the employer and the employee. So if the employee fails to provide information, that starts frustrating that employment contract. You're trying to accommodate by inquiring and learning how you can work with the employee to make sure that they come back to the workplace to the best of their ability. But if they're not sharing, then that does frustrate it. So that's one thing that, as employers, that is often very fact specific. So it is an area where even getting a couple of hours advice, you don't have to have somebody on retainer for that, but getting a bit of advice about how to manage that scenario is very useful. I hate to kind of plug going to lawyers, but sometimes a couple of hours kind of early on in that that discussion period will minimize kind of a challenge later.
Yeah, and there's a couple of interesting points there. Like you mentioned, like the employment contract, and what we're really talking about in that is it's the relationship. And there's when the law looks at an employer and an employee, they see a contractual relationship, and each side has different duties of what it is that they need to do to be able to perform that contract. And frustrating a contract is basically like not doing your job very well or being a shit employer, is essentially what that piece. Don't tell my students that I've said it like that, because I'll lose it.
Well, no, but if
But yeah.
an employer is the subject of a human rights complaint, and it's because somebody says that they've not been accommodated, and the employer can say, look, we tried to communicate, and it was just, and I use frustration in that general employment relationship way. If that conversation ended up one-sided, and it's only the employer side. Now, I've had the flip side where I had a client who was an employee with a federally regulated industry, and he was providing all the information, and they weren't doing any of their side of the conversation. So we were successful at the Human Rights Tribunal. So,
and this is a piece too, I think, where it's the work that you do beforehand that helps you in that scenario, right? So when we see the duty to inquire coming up around like mental health, I think that's where it gets a little bit trickier than someone coming back, from a physical injury. It can be people are a little bit less. What's the word? Less nervous about approaching that conversation, as people can be sometimes with mental health. And I think this is where, doing all the work to actually understand mental health, and to have a culture in your workplace where people feel like they can talk about their mental health, can share what it is that they need, where, there's a script in place already from HR to those employees to understand how you can give that feedback. And we've seen this at Digny, in surveying workplaces over the pandemic, is the change for folks, when we talk about that caregiver relationship or having children or dependents, what that looks like and how that impacts, your engagement at work. And the pandemic has really shifted that, sometimes in a really positive way and sometimes not. But it certainly is something that you want to be able to really dig into, and again, understand. So having really clear policies, having it, known that, if an individual didn't really have their own mental health on their radar, and then all of a sudden did, that they could quickly understand that their HR rep understood about mental health, and they could broach that conversation, because there was already, a script within the organization to know. And I say script in that, like, the language of mental health is used. You've seen it in a newsletter. That there's something available to you to help you, to support and foster good mental health at work. Those things can be really helpful. KRISTIN, I know we're dancing into your area of expertise here. So I just do want to encourage you, if you have any questions, to tell me to be quiet for a moment.
No, I'm loving this conversation, and the duty to inquire is one that certainly I get asked a lot, in particular, with mental health. And so one of the things that Anik and I say a lot when we're doing workshops on this or working with clients is, it's so important to know your employees. So to have that human connection, and to be able to notice when there are shifts and changes in how they show up, literally and figuratively, in the workplace. And I'll share a really quick story, actually, that actually has to do with me and Annika. So when Annika and I first met back in 2007, when she hired me to work as a recruiter, and she was the manager of talent in an organization. And about 6 months into the new job for me, I was starting to go into a depressive episode. And so I'm a person with chronic recurring depression and anxiety. And she said to me one day, KRISTIN, I noticed that you're not quite yourself. And it's funny, because we didn't talk about this until probably about 4 years ago, when we started consulting together to see what the different sides of that scenario were. And because there was a bit of trust that we already had 6 months into our working relationship, when she noticed that and I felt seen, I said to her, yeah, actually, I'm kind of struggling with my mental health right now. And for me, it was an opportunity to kind of let go of the breath that I'd been holding. And now I felt like I had somebody I could talk to about this in the workplace. But you can imagine too, when you're starting a new job in a new organization, you're trying to show up in a particular way. Annika, do you feel like sharing your side of that story?
Sure, yeah, if it's helpful. Um, I hesitated, but only briefly. And I think it was for a few of the things we've talked about. Liz, I love how you mentioned, one thing an employer can do, have the policies, the process, and the training that really equips the managers to know what to do. But all that aside, because I had not been a manager that long, I didn't know if I would have the perfect words to phrase the question. I didn't want to offend KRISTIN. I didn't want to assume that I knew something. And if she did say something that she needed, I wasn't sure that I'd be able to give her that. But all that remained true. And when I said it to her and she shared with me, then we used the employee assistance provider. She saw her doctor. She got the advice she needed. It doesn't come from her manager. But when we only talked about it 4 years ago, she so appreciates that. And I don't think I fully understood how much she appreciated it. And then I told her how nervous I was. She said, I didn't come across, but I was really nervous that I would misstep. So when we talk to managers now, we say, better that you don't have perfect language and you just offer up a question and you go from there than that you don't inquire and you don't say anything at all.
That's a really good example of doing things in good faith too, right? Like was that what you were going to say, Fiona?
Well, and that's you've done exactly what was right. It was like you're just not seeming yourself, and good faith, like you did your best. What sometimes also happens though is you do have people that are more blunt, like your performance is not as good as it was. What's going on? Like you're having a marital issues. I actually did work in a workplace where there was something as blunt as that, and it was quite shocking to hear about after the fact. I was not involved in it, but it was relayed to me afterwards, and it was just it's a discretion, like what you kind of had, Annika, and like you just it's compassion for somebody, right? And not everybody's going to have that same level of knowledge and trust, but by doing what you've suggested, Liz, having thought about it, this is one of the big things I've done in some of my world. If you plan in advance, you're not going to have those awkward conversations. They're going to be more subtle because you've thought about it. So the policies, just conversations regularly with the HR people about, what do we do if we see somebody struggling? How do we need to pass this on? And then you will have done that duty to inquire in a respectful way. And it will get a good conversation going. So hopefully you can accommodate them and not get them defensive and then them immediately saying, I'm being accused of something.
Well, and importantly, it helps the employee to get some support earlier on, especially from a personal perspective, like maybe they don't know what's going on for them in their struggle, or they don't know how something is coming out. And the sooner that person can get some support, the better off they'll be, which is excellent for them as an individual and also good for your workplace, right? You don't have someone, that may need, more support down the end, or may have further to come back from, had they have had support earlier on.
Liz, can I add something to this? Yeah. The other thing that I get asked is, it's this whole idea of how do I talk to somebody if I think that they're struggling with a mental health challenge? And so my sort of flippant response is often, don't wait until you think they're struggling. And so what I mean by that is if we normalize these topics in the workplace, that disability, for example, is not inability, and that mental health is just like physical health, and that as an employer or as a manager, we actually care about human beings. Like employees are human beings. And so if we create an environment where there is a level of psychological safety, where it's like, I can say to Annika, my manager, This is what I'm experiencing right now. I'm still committed to work, and it's important for me to come here because I really love the work I do and the people I work with, and it's actually helping me. But please know that this is kind of what's going on, whether it's a change in family status or, a health issue. If we create an environment where it's okay to talk about these things, then I think actually in the long run, it's to your point earlier, Fiona, about if we actually plan out how we have these conversations, we need to set the tone that it's okay to have these conversations as well. And then we can avoid some of the yucky stuff that can come when we're not clear. Brene Brown says clear is kind. So unclear is unkind. So if we just take some time to be intentional about the environment that we're creating, I mean, that's what an inclusive workplace is.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, so it's a gratuitous plug for for doing training, but for being strategic, and thinking about we talk about human resources and HR, but we sometimes forget that it's human resources. We're talking about people as your resources, and we need them to be doing well, for the whole machine of your company to be working really well. And this is a really important way to do it, because it doesn't just impact that one individual in the workplace. Like, everybody else is watching, right? So having small children is, one impacts the other, and everybody's always watching your every move. So you need to be aware of that, because that's where you see the workplace culture piece fall apart, right? If you can't support one individual like that, everybody else at work probably sees and knows that, and your culture in your workplace will take a big hit, and that can affect, it can affect your brand, your reputation. It can affect the engagement of all of your employees there. You really want to be able to have a good handle on those pieces. All right, duty to inquire, check. We get a lot of questions, from some small businesses. And so this is we're very Canadian in our focus today, which is delightful, because sometimes we get too much of a blend. But what do small businesses need to know about diversity, equity, and inclusion and the law in Canada? And then maybe we'll expand it to businesses generally. But if we focus on some of those smaller businesses, what do they really need to know here, do you think?
I think a basic understanding of the Human Rights Act code in their respective provinces, and how that might work if there is a complaint. That it is a bit of a long process that can be quite costly. You don't need to have a lawyer, but certainly outcomes are better. But it can be definitely a challenge. But there's a lot of information out there that they are designed to be fairly accessible tribunals if you do have a complaint made.
Mm-hmm.
It is understanding what those different personal characteristics are, and it's really understanding that if you do something that you wouldn't do to somebody else, and you've done it because of a personal characteristic such as religion, political belief, place of origin, then you might have a bit of a problem.
Mm-hmm. And when
think
you say, I was just going to clarify, just when you say personal characteristics, you're talking about like the actual list in the Human Rights Code in each province and territory that says these are the groups that cannot be discriminated against under law. It identifies all of those. And then it sometimes has exceptions of when you can do that, like employment equity programs on, your duty to accommodate if you're smaller. And then we look to the common law to understand how we define all of those. Because some of them, like you mentioned it before, like the family status, some of those pieces can be difficult to understand what the definition is. And that's when we look to the case law to understand that.
So the BC Human Rights Code, which is the law that applies to anything human rights, has very specific characteristics laid out. So it's something personal to whoever is making the complaint. There's nuances to some of them. Just saying place of origin sometimes is a bit too shorthand. So if you want to understand a little bit of that, then you go into the decisions of the Human Rights Tribunal. But if they do have any of those protected characteristics, the ones that are listed in the Human Rights Code, and they've experienced an adverse effect or a negative consequence in employment because of that, then that's when a complaint might arise. So an employer should know kind of generally that the Human Rights Code exists, what those personal characteristics are, and be aware of them, so that when they're making their choices, they're not like, that person has different skin color than me, so I'm not hiring them. Like that would definitely run afoul of the Human Rights Tribunal. They may also want to consider, if they're wanting some kind of more advice and they do want to look to improve their diversity and equity and inclusivity, to special programs. There is an ability in BC under the Human Rights Tribunal Code, the Human Rights Act rather, Code, pardon me, to get permission to promote certain groups. And the special programs are actually through the Human Rights Commission, which is newly reformed in this province. And really, they think they consider special programs as a unique opportunity to kind of advance DEI in the province. And they're looking at what it means is treating some people differently, or it may mean treating some people the same way. It's very fact dependent. So it may be something you want to consider if some of these recognized groups that I'll detail in a moment, if any of them are kind of who you're seeking to promote and increase their equity. So exactly. So you've got special programs could be used to assist the following disadvantaged groups: Indigenous people, racialized groups, and that may be because there's been subtle or overt stereotyping based on race. People with disabilities. This is often, as I think you were mentioning before, KRISTIN, this idea of it's not disability, it's differently abled. So how can we make sure that we're not kind of using any stereotypes on somebody who's physically or mentally disabled? Women is still considered a group that may be subject of these special programs, along with transgender people. So it is a process to apply to the Human Rights Commission for approval, and they do outline on the BC Human Rights Commission website the process. It may take 90 days to get a decision if you are wanting to promote, to develop a program that does promote a certain group. It is something that even if you don't go through that process and get that blessing, some of that documentation we talked about before, that transparency, will ensure as well that you've kind of got that same spirit, even if you've not gone through that process. They do audit you. That is one of the steps. So if you've asked to have a special program implemented, there will be, and it's approved, there will be an auditing afterwards. So it may or may not be suitable for all employers, but it certainly provides a bit of a comfort, I'm sure, for some. You just have to be prepared for a bit of a process to have that blessing from the Human Rights Commission.
I'm just going to share in the chat some of the links that people might find useful from the Human Rights Tribunal there. So definitely knowing what all of those characteristics are and how they're understood, I think, is really important. I think overarching all of that is understanding what your strategy is in promoting, DEI is. You don't want to just print off this list and take a dart and throw it at the screen and say, that's the group we're going to promote, because it's a touch random, and not necessarily an ideal way to do it. You want to be able to have done that strategic work to figure out, what industry are you in? What groups aren't represented? You want to look at the metrics of diversity within your organization to understand that. A lot of the groups that we're talking about here that are protected, you don't necessarily know if you have that representation in your workplace. Just by looking at somebody, there's really only a few that you might be able to tell from someone's physical appearance. So really understanding who your workplace is, and this is the Digny gratuitous plug, by doing the diversity metrics anonymously so that you know who's actually working for you there. And that's where we see, I watch our clients often be really surprised at what they get back with, with their diversity data, especially around mental health, especially around like learning disabilities has been a big one that we've identified that their employers didn't know about, and they've been able to sort of say, like, working virtually has actually worked really well for a lot of people that work with us, because this suits their learning style. It suits how they like to interact with others. And for other people, it doesn't work very well. Some people have caregiver responsibilities and, you know, are responsible for dependents. Working from home works really well for them to be able to be more flexible. And in other words, others need to be out of the home to be able to work much more efficiently. You know, so it's that understanding who are the people, the resources that you actually have in your organization, and how can you best work with them. And you need to be able to know who they are, and you need to be able to be strategic about how it is that you're going to go about supporting them to, you know, to be as helpful as possible.
I really will agree that kind of finding out before you plan a program is quite key, because people have invisible physical disabilities. Their family status, their caregiving responsibilities may be completely invisible. It may change too. I've had caregiving responsibilities change in the last 2 years for a couple of different reasons. And so that is not necessarily visible to my employer because I'm working virtually. So having those conversations and recognizing that things change. And I think there was a reference, I think by you, Annika, to EAP, Employee Assistant Programs, having those available. And that's not always available to small employers. However, if there's, you know, ways of working with other small employers and having a group EAP, because that's outside of the organization, it at least provides, again, somebody to talk to and find out what resources are available. Because I find that I've known entrepreneurs that had no idea what an EAP was, because they've been entrepreneurs their whole life and may not have ever had access to EAP. So if there's things like that, especially for small employers, that we can promote and somehow, you know, create more synergy there, that just means your employees have a way of talking.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of small businesses, they may only have one person in HR, you know, or just 2 or 3. So the level of expertise that they need to be able to fulfill the role of HR, it is really broad. So being able to identify, you know, what are the areas where, you know, you might need some more support, or you might need to bring in, you know, some external support to achieve some of those goals, I think is a really important piece. I want to make sure that I leave time for any questions that anyone may have, mostly to prevent myself from rambling anymore. So I'll give you guys that opportunity. I love that Fiona laughs at all my jokes. I really appreciate it, Fiona.
They're always important.
If anybody has any questions, specific or not, please do feel free to unmute or just pose the question in the chat. I think overall, you know, what I want to drive home when we talk about employment law and diversity, equity, and inclusion is that sometimes we think that diversity and inclusion, you know, sit in this elective topic of, wouldn't it be nice if we could just do this as well, when really it's fundamental to your relationship as an employer, to that employment contract that you have with employees, and it runs really deep, both in consequences, positive and negative, to your workplace, and that you really do stand to benefit from being strategic at the outset, and being transparent and accountable about what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it. Generally will put you in really good stead, and tying those things to actions as well, right? Like, you know, saying we want to increase diversity by Molly, and we want to really open things up and understand why we're doing that. Tying that to metrics can be really helpful as well, because we're talking about, you know, these are protected characteristics and protected grounds for a reason, right? As people have been discriminated against based on those at such a level that it's landed in the law. So people will, you know, be reluctant to share that information and not want to be seen as different, or not want to expose themselves. So being able to measure those metrics anonymously can be really helpful. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments or closing thoughts as we come to the end of our session today? no, we nailed it. Everyone's getting my employment law final in their email, and great.
I will just say, as a lawyer, my plug when it comes to consulting with a lawyer is do it earlier, and then you'll just have a framework, and then that framework may not be applicable in every single case of needing to accommodate an employee, for instance. However, you'll have enough of a framework and enough kind of information in your head that your next conversation with a lawyer is probably only 15 minutes, and you're not dealing with 25 to 45 to 100 hours with that lawyer at the Human Rights Tribunal because there has been a complaint.
Right.
So I'm front loading definitely is one of the things I suggest, because then you won't need me in the long run.
It's a great suggestion. And I think sometimes people are nervous about engaging a lawyer to start with. They think, well, I'm gonna do this and this and this, I'll muddle through it. And then they end up maybe making a bit of a muddle of it. And then they really need the lawyer. So to have, I think, a trusted partner can be really, really helpful.
That's fabulous. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording.